Hello, everyone, and welcome to CGHE seminar webinar number 268. I'm Xin from Oxford Department of Education, and today we'll be hearing from CGHE Director Professor Simon Marginson on a really important topic that is about higher education as student self-formation. Before I hand over to Simon, there's some brief housekeeping points to mention. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CGHE website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. And there's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so that you can more clearly see who is talking. And to ask the question, please use the chat function and write out the question you would like to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you'll be invited to ask it yourself directly. And when being invited, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you're from. So now, without further ado, I will now pass over to Simon for today's CGHE webinar.
Well, thanks very much, Shannon. I'll just get the screen share going. You can now see that, I guess.
We can see it, but not in the presentation mode yet.
I'm just about to bring that up. It's my... Okay, just this moment. There we are.
Excellent.
Well, hello everyone. Nice to see people coming in to the webinar today. Now today I want to make an argument for what for some will be a new approach to higher education. And this is, we call higher education as self-formation. It centres higher education not on government and policy or the institution as the central agent, as judged by rankings and surveys, or even on the academic teacher as a responsible agent in the classroom, but on the student as the primary agent. A student-centred approach to higher education, not, I hope, a fake student-centredness as in the consumer model, but a genuine student-centredness. And I'll argue that this approach is at the very core of what actually happens and what should happen in higher education. Now, the question of what higher education does is surprisingly unclear to us. More than 40% of all young people leaving school this year will enter tertiary education at some point in their lifetimes. Higher education is a very large social sector. Many institutions have multiple social, economic, cultural, and political roles, and they have international as well as national and local connections. Definitions, expectations, evaluations, and judgments about higher education are a potpourri of policy systems, economic and sociological and psychological paradigms, and ideologies and myths. Yet, I think clarification is within our competence. As I see it, higher education generates two kinds of outcomes. The first, the direct effects of higher education are the most important. These are, firstly, the education of students, and second, the production, communication, reproduction, and transmission of knowledge through research, scholarship, and teaching. When higher education is adequately resourced, I believe it can be held fully accountable for those outcomes. Education and knowledge are also foundational to most of the other outcomes. Attempts to measure and improve higher education should, I believe, be focused mainly on these direct outcomes. Well, what then are the other outcomes? Well, we can call these mediated effects produced in interactions between higher education and other social sectors. They include the production of skilled labour power, employable human capital, the allocation of opportunities and credentials across populations, the formation of political citizens, the contributions to tolerance, international relations, and so on. And there are many other mediated outcomes of this kind. Now, these outcomes are judged by scales of value that are external to higher education and outside its control. For example, graduate salary levels. I want to emphasise that higher education does not directly control or not wholly control these mediated outcomes. For example, graduate employment or unemployment is partly shaped by labour market fluctuations. The social inequality of outcomes is partly shaped by inequalities between families and in the workplace. We cannot accurately measure higher education's impact in these mediated domains because of the social science problem of independence. Here, the sector's impact is being contaminated by these other social forces at play. We cannot tell exactly what the sector does and what these other parts of society do to contribute to these mediated outcomes. For example, in the UK, 2 universities provide an identical educational experience. The graduates of one earn twice as much as the other. The high earners are from powerful families and wealthy London suburbs. The low earners are from a northern town hard hit by a recession. What then does the comparison between the outcomes of these universities tell us about the education received? Absolutely nothing. Now, what higher education can do is educate students as well as possible. It cannot control their ultimate destinations. The mediated social outcomes get all the policy attention, it seems. Now, this is bad because it's shifting attention away from what higher education actually does, can be expected to do in itself, and can be expected to improve. The contribution of higher education is best advanced, I believe, by focusing on the core functions of education and knowledge, while also enhancing the external connections between those core functions and the rest of society. Now, today, I'll focus on the core education function, on student development, which occurs in conjunction with the other direct function of knowledge. But here we have some dead wood, 2 models we need to discard. First, the deficit model of the student as an empty vessel waiting to be filled. The student as other-formed, not self-formed. It's true that factors external to the student are crucial, including knowledge and teaching, time and money, the institutional setting, and other students. However, the empty vessel model misses the crucial importance of the student's own agency in learning. Second, there's the model of the student as an economic consumer. Now, this sidesteps knowledge as if it doesn't matter what the students learn, only what they earn, and it imposes a fluctuating external valuation that robs both the education and the student or graduate of agency. And how much power can students exercise in an education market? How strong are they really? They have to choose their course before they know what the options really are. And once they choose, there are heavy costs in changing course. Hence, student-centeredness is just a power of market exit, which is very difficult to use, and when used by one individual, has very little effect on what is being provided. The student as consumer power is an illusory power. But the point about this is that it's not student-centeredness of the kind that's really needed in the educational process itself. As I said, students are involved in a process of self-formation in the educational setting, which they determine, though under conditions that they do not control. This idea of higher education as student self-formation emerged from empirical work with international students who are moving across cultural settings and undergoing a process of rapid reflexive change. And also from conversations over the years with student activists who criticise the consumer ideology and argue, no, I'm forming myself in education. I'm not a consumer. I'm an active co-producer of my own education. Now, in contrast with the idea of other formation, self-formation rests centrally on reflexive student agency. In contrast with the consumer model, this agency is focused not on earning, but on learning and self-development. Evolving agency is both the necessary condition and the medium of student learning. Only the student does the actual learning. And augmented self-forming agency of graduates is also the main outcome of higher education, an outcome they carry throughout their lives. Higher education as self-formation is both an ideal to be achieved because it's not presently maximised in existing higher education, and it's also a framework for understanding existing practices. Now, this idea of higher education as self-formation is not altogether new. It's not a big theme in contemporary economically informed policy, but it has long roots in educational philosophy and pedagogy. Confucian self-cultivation retains its vitality in the Chinese civilizational zone. Euro-America has the parallel tradition, the German tradition of Bildung, that sees higher education as a journey to autonomous, responsible public citizens. John Dewey and the pragmatists in the United States see higher education in parallel as a kind of personal growth process. And J.H. Newman in the 19th century England and Ireland was focusing on the cultivation of persons in knowledge. Perhaps these older traditions underestimate learner autonomy. And there's a touch of other formation about them because of their determination to position students in a fixed set of social relations. I'll come back to that point. But nonetheless, they centre on the student and on the process of cultivation and growth. Now, of course, higher education is not the only domain where people form themselves. I mean, Anthony Giddens described modern life as a never-ending reflexive project of the self. Political democracy, the spread of mass education, and borderless markets have all brought the critical reflexive self to the forefront of our own thinking. Consider consumption, fashion, body management, wellness, the fascination with self-made identity, and others. But what then distinguishes self-formation in higher education? Well, as I'll discuss, the core features include the immersion in knowledge and access to diverse experiences, relations, and ways of seeing in distinctive student and higher education communities. Now, as I see it, the essential elements of this idea of higher education as self-formation, which are integrated, are the autonomy of the learner, the will to learn, reflexive agency, and immersion in knowledge. Now, I'll briefly expand on these elements, and I'll refer to intellectual resources that help us to think about them and perhaps might help us design programs to research self-formation. Well, self-formation begins with autonomous persons with agency freedom, capable of self-directed and conscious action, who can apply their will to their own objectives. And Marginson states that agency freedom is secured when people have the capabilities to lead the life they value. Capabilities, he says, depend on the nature of the social arrangements, which can be crucial for individual freedoms, including income, education, and health. Now, structural inequalities shape the terrain on which agency is formed and exercised. But economic, social, and political structure are not an absolute barrier to human agents in education or anywhere else. For the disadvantaged, in fact, agency is the augmented agency is the way through structural barriers. Let me expand on this point. And Margaret Archer focuses on structure and agency, and she describes a continuing interplay between external elements and the agencies of persons, the persons who collectively constitute society. We are simultaneously free and constructed, she says, and we also have some awareness of it. Archer emphasises that neither structure nor agency is immutable, fixed. Both structure and agency are emergent, continually changing, and relations between them are open. The human being is neither pre-given nor socially constructed, she says. Structure and agency have causal powers, each of them, and they can affect each other. However, they're not in a kind of symmetry or balance. Rather, they're different levels of a stratified social reality. Agential powers, says Archer, are conditioned by, affected by, but not determined by the socio-cultural context. People are not puppets of structures because they have their own emergent properties, their unpredictable creative powers as human beings. Agents have autonomy. This is so positive, so important for us in education. It means that we're never wholly trapped by structures of domination. It means that building agency can expand our freedoms. It means that higher education can be transformative. Now, what makes this possible is the reflective character of agency, the space it creates for itself from early in life within our minds. Each student's evolving sense of self and life pathway, this sense of who I am, who I'm becoming, and what I want to be, where I'm going, is sustained by a conscious reflexive agency in the inner self. The continuing processes of critical self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-criticism, and self-regulation. Reflexive agency is at the heart of intellectual formation, setting goals, planning relations, and building careers. Archer discusses the inner mental life of agents and their reflexivity. She argues that a continuous sense of self, the autonomous bearer of expectations and responsibilities, is universal to the human condition. Our self-consciousness as persons emerges early in life and is the source of reflexive self-consciousness that lasts throughout life, she says. Archer states that our autonomy enables our private consciousness, what she calls the synthesizing self, where we reflect on our social or public selves. So there's these two selves. There's the social self and there's the continuous inner self. In this rich inner life where we reflect on reality, this what she calls the inner conversation with ourselves, we give shape to our lives. We change ourselves. Now, this inner conversation, it's a bit like Bourdieu's habitus, a kind of inner negotiation between structure and agency, the mode of articulation between people and reality, as Archer puts it. Archer emphasizes that this inner self is not pre-given. It's self-constructed, it's self-formed, it's continually developing, continually shaped in practice, in fact, through living actively in the world. I mean, likewise, Lev Vygotsky identifies the formation of the infant's sense of self through its self-driven reach out into social language. It starts to talk to its parents and others, and it begins to develop its own sense of itself and its own inner conversation in this process. Vygotsky's self is double-coded. Individual agency is always socially separated and socially embedded. And Archer makes the same point, noting also that these two codes are not the same. And so there's space for self-development along novel lines where we don't have to follow social patterns. We have our own inner self, which enables us to make our own thoughts, our own decisions about who we are. And so that two different students can self-form in very varied ways within the same curriculum. But autonomous agency and reflexivity entail work. For example, in a challenging program of higher education, they entail a lot of work. Self-knowledge is something that we produce internally and dialogically. It's not something that we discover lying inside us, says Archer. In higher education, when the education function is whirring along in high gear, people are transforming themselves through the never-ending work of the self on the self, as Foucault puts it. Now, some will know Archer's work. Some who are involved in this webinar will be quite familiar with Margaret Archer, but perhaps less will know about late work done by Michel Foucault. And Foucault returned to the Greeks and the Romans in his last 3 or 4 years to explore how to ground autonomy. His mission was to escape the power knowledge panopticon and the governmentality's capture of freedom, which he described so brilliantly in his early work. He was looking for ways out. The late work of Foucault, his work on the constitution of oneself as a subject, as he puts it, is less well known than his earlier work, but arguably it's the most important. In a 2017 study by Stephen Ball summarizes it by saying that while Foucault shows that education is one of the key sites in which the processes of normalization are enacted, education is also a locus of struggle for productive processes of self-formation and freedom. And in this discussion about the way out, how to ground autonomy, Foucault talks about others who are in the self-formation territory like Kant and Bildung, their project of forming autonomous persons in education. I think Foucault's work of the self on the self concept resembles Confucian self-cultivation also, but there are no references to Sinic culture in Foucault. It's as if China didn't exist, perhaps a case of parallel evolution. So another source for understanding autonomous and reflexive agency is empirical psychology. And not only Vygotsky on the social formation of individual agency, but Richard Ryan and Edward Decky's theory of self-determination and Albert Bandura's massive work on agency. Now, as with Archer on the reflexive inner conversation, the insights and techniques of empirical psychology can help us in developing research programs for investigating self-formation in higher education. Ryan and Decky identify universal human desires for autonomy, competence, and engagement. People are, they say, curious, vital, and self-motivated. At their best, they're agentic and inspired, striving to learn, extend themselves, master new skills, and apply their talents responsibly. Most people, they say, show considerable effort, agency, and commitment in their lives, which suggests, they say, some very positive and persisting features in human nature. It's always nice to read Ryan and Decky because they're very upbeat about agency. Self-determination is seen as accumulative and emergent. People align what they learn with who they are in a continuing reflexive process. Ryan and Decky theorize unconscious tendencies like most in psychology, but they also emphasize conscious agency, especially in the integration process. Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory emphasizes conscious agency. He focuses centrally on reflective self-consciousness and intentionality. His idea of agency has 3 primary aspects: forethought, self-reactiveness, and self-reflectiveness. And self-reflective people are self-examiners of their functioning. He says that this is continually exercised in education. Bandura emphasizes that individual and collective agentic factors can be modified to affect individual and social change. A major goal of formal education, he states, should be to equip students with the intellectual tools, self-beliefs, and self-regulatory capabilities to educate themselves throughout their lifetime. That's an admonition to the idea of higher education as self-formation. Well, let's turn more specifically to student self-formation in higher education itself. And what are the main features or potential features of self-formation in our sector? Well, first, as indicated, higher education is soaked in knowledge, or it should be. As Paul Ashwin argues, unless knowledge is central, we're not talking about higher education. This also foregrounds the role of teaching in what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. Teachers know knowledge, students know less. Students need teachers. Second, in these large and often cosmopolitan institutions, full-time students have often rich opportunities for diverse experiences and multiple ways of seeing inside and outside the classroom. This includes peer group relations and often, but not always, a sense of belonging to a much larger cohort than they will experience at any other time in their lives. The learner is not an empty vessel waiting to be filled. The learner is a person with a will, a drive to learn. Though this can be triggered extrinsically by the discipline of parents, peer example, inspiring teaching, or credentialing requirements, there is an irreducible moment in all successful learning when academic self-formation becomes an intrinsic process. Now, some do this more effectively than others. Jin Lee, in a brilliant comparison of education in the Western tradition and empirical workers in the United States and in China, finds that the will to learn, or Liji, is especially visible in the Chinese civilizational zone. It embodies not narrow task discipline, but holistic self-formation. For Guoping Zhao and Zhongyi Deng, person making is at the heart of the Confucian heritage of educational thinking. Self-cultivation is the precondition, they say, for developing the critical and creative potentials of the individual and enabling him or her to fulfill social responsibilities and functions. The Confucian self is not a finished entity. She or he is always becoming, engaged in a never-finished process of self-perfection. And here, self-formation through learning is understood as a moral responsibility, a duty. Jin Lee states that in the Confucian tradition, learning is the most important thing in life. It is life's purpose. The starting point for Chinese people's learning affect is establishing one's Liji, commitment to learning, with the whole heart and mind, often by the age of 6 or 7 years, primarily in the home and the family, not the school. Young children learn that, quote, seeking knowledge requires resolve, diligence, endurance of hardship, steadfastness, concentration, and humility. The concept of hua shui xin, passion for learning, becomes universally understood in China. Lee also cites Sari, who finds that Chinese children develop an inner self in order to retain a private space of their own. So all the elements very much there from an early age: autonomy, reflexivity, self-formation. But the autonomous psionic individual is always firmly anchored in society, not floating free. The term Ren, which loosely can be translated as humanity, is at the heart of psionic self-formation. And Ren exists in relationships. I mean, Ren combines the words for two and the word and human being. In China, knowledge is primarily seen not as a source of utilitarian benefits for the self, although these are important, but as a means of self-cultivation in the journey towards perfection as a social being, and also as a means of making direct contributions to society. Knowledge is both individualized and a collective property in any society. The codes of each discipline permeate society, economy, and culture. Far from being a retreat from the real world, academic knowledge is the medium that most directly engages the student in social relations during their studies. Through knowledge, they connect to an enormous worldwide conversation. Self-formation through immersion in knowledge is therefore also a form of social formation. The role of knowledge in self-formation cannot be understood in solid generic terms. Students form themselves through the meaning they attribute to knowledge, and as Bernstein notes, the disciplines foster differing kinds of reflexive consciousness. Ashman and colleagues investigate student learning in sociology, noting that over time, students become more confident in their accounts of the world through the medium of the discipline. They absorb the discipline into their own mentality. The researchers also note that most students stop short of full self-transformation through sociology. Students' engagement with knowledge alone is not enough. There also needs to be an alignment between students' personal projects and the focus of disciplinary knowledge. Students must invest in knowledge. Perhaps that investment is most complete for doctoral students. I mean, they immerse themselves ever more deeply in knowledge and in their own reflexive mentality at the same time. Growing the project intellectually becomes growing oneself. But all students can grow themselves through higher education. You don't have to do a PhD degree to achieve this. Now, should higher education set out to shape the self-formation of students in terms of prescriptions for the ideal or the better society? Well, I think this is the most difficult issue that arises from the self-formation paradigm. If we did think that students should be educated to adopt a particular view of society, would that be consistent with the foundational notion of agentic self-formation, especially agency freedom? Well, the theorists who intersect with education as self-formation touch on the social formation aspect in various ways and at various points in the process of development of the person. Vygotsky, Dewey, and C.P. Mead model the formative interactions between the individual and the social. Confucianism forms individuals explicitly in social relations from the beginning, while Bildung and American pragmatism see education as a tool of social reform, forming individuals to change society. One translation of the German Bildung is self-formation. Others are development and inner cultivation. Immanuel Kant sees education as the crucial instrument of modernism and progress. Kantian education forms an active autonomous subject who thinks independently without guidance from the authorities, lives in the public sphere, and uses reason in a public way. This is the notion of a civil society in formation. Yet, like Confucianism, Bildung was turned to nation building and the preparation of the national elite. For example, in von Humboldt's famous prescription for the University of Berlin. Well, should higher education shape the self-formation of students in terms of a better society? Well, Confucianism and Bildung say yes, but what ideal society would we talk about? Who would decide? When free agents are being harnessed to a teleological project, it's a slippery slope. We foster relational values in higher education, including respect for cultural diversity, socioeconomic equity, and opposition to discrimination based on gender, race, or ethnicity, and ableness. It's another thing to specify the whole social order. We cannot know or control the future. I mean, rather, higher education should enhance the scope of students and graduates to make their lives and their society as they will. Higher education cannot directly remake class or income or racial hierarchies. Its great contribution lies in nurturing self-forming agents, steeped in knowledge, able to act effectively and creatively in the face of structural barriers. Well, I'll now move to some concluding points. Policy and institutions should foster the scope for self-forming student agency to flourish in all kinds of ways. On one hand, this means minimizing the constraints such as racism and discrimination. On the other hand, it means enhancing the capacity and the scope of students as proactive agents. For example, ensuring financial support that enables students to genuinely study full-time rather than having to work for most of the week, as so many students have to do. Access to teachers and learning resources is also crucial. So is deep exposure to diverse perspectives, whether it's through mobility, which can be tremendously exciting in terms of self-development, or access to varied groups of student peers on a single campus site. Another implication is for educational research. Recent and current doctoral projects are focusing on the self-formation of mobile students in social and civic settings and academic self-formation in classrooms. The core components of self-formation, autonomy, agency, reflexivity, the will to learn, and immersion in knowledge, suggest many possibilities for research, especially longitudinal research. Archer's inner conversation and student self-determination are fecund zones of potential empirical inquiry. Much can be learned by comparing self-formation in different disciplines and in different national cultural contexts. I'm keen to see comparisons of self-formation in online and face-to-face programs. Wouldn't that set the cat among the pigeons? The direct outcomes of higher education in education and research are the most important. It's what we can do. It's what we can make visible. It's what we should do. And it's central to everything else that generates value in higher education. It's in these domains higher education builds the capacity to generate those mediated social benefits I discussed, such as value-creating economic actors and thinking tolerant citizens. The development of students as self-forming, self-educating agents is the largest of these direct outcomes. Agentic self-formation is a condition of higher education. It's the central process, arguably, and it's the most important contribution that higher education can make, developing this in people. In this framework, higher education is a concentrated period of self-formation within the life course, marked by agency freedom, conscious reflexivity, and immersion in complex knowledges. Very challenging if it's to be done well. Now, this vision of higher education towers above the narrow utilitarian vision that's presently so pervasive, limiting what governments and publics want from higher education and reducing students' own horizons. Higher education and self-formation does not diminish the contributions of higher education. It expands them greatly. I mean, the CGHE webinars by Thun Pham have shown that graduates with enhanced personal agency and the capacity to continually learn and develop themselves reflexively are much more effective at work. Well, some may say it's rather obvious. Students and learning are central, yes. But I don't think it is obvious. Higher education is not always practiced this way, and it's rarely talked about or judged or regulated this way. The student as self-forming agent is not at the centre of the picture at all. When that self-forming student moves to the centre of higher education, it will be a different world. Thanks, Shin. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think the presentation really opens up lots of topics for discussion. And I can see in the chat, there's a question very directly about this strand of work of higher education and student self-formation. So Hongblei, who asked me to ask this question, is that is the presentation built on any of the works that have been published or unpublished? And would you be able to explain a bit more about this, please?
You can detect the beginnings of this in the 2014 paper in Journal of Studies in International Education, which you probably know. And there's a 2018 booklet that was published by the Institute of Education in London at UCL, which contains a lot of references to the literature that I talked about today. but the sort of more fully formed form of it, I'm currently attempting to get it published in a journal. I've also prepared it as a book chapter, and there's another book chapter coming out. I can send you the draft book chapter if you write to me.
Thank you, Simon. And I think
I'm thinking about a book, but I think that, I mean, what soyounglee is doing is really advanced, and I think ahead of me in terms of academic self-formation. So, I mean, maybe we'll a group of us who are working on self-formation idea, like Yusuf Aldark and Soyoung, myself, we can put out a joint book of some kind.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I can see a hand up by Susan and also a few questions. Perhaps we'll take the questions in a group. So firstly, can I invite Susan to ask her question, please?
Hi, Susan.
So I only got the tail end of it, Simon, but I was desperate to come. But I'd seen the abstract and I know some of what you're kind of doing. And I think it's incredibly important, both politically, but also theoretically, because what I see you doing is actually introducing some quite sophisticated sociology, Archer's work and so on, into the engagement with higher education. And that's been, in my view, kind of really sadly kind of missing. Drawing on critical realists, but particularly Archer's work around a kind of morphogenesis kind of approach, which is a very dynamic approach as well. But that kind of realist kind of ontology actually enables the multiplicities of the dynamics that actually are constitutive of so-called subjects. And then I'm just going to make a final kind of reflection. One of my favorite writers is Doug Porpora. And one of the things he muses over in a book called Reconstructing Sociology, and he's a critical realist, is, you know, why do we use terms like subjects? You know, he says, why don't we talk about them as persons? We don't talk about where's the subjectivity gone? We say, where's the person gone? And there's something then about the language that we use, that abstract language, that takes us some distance from, you know, thinking people, you know, sensorial individuals, etc. So just a comment. Thank you, Simon.
It's so true, isn't it? And I think that one of my colleagues who's chairing this webinar, in fact, is working on the question of humanness, you know, and in research, and that that perspective, I think, helps make the correction which we need to make. But the notion of self-forming agents and the emphasis on the potentials of agency, it does that too. I mean, I think Archer's tremendous. I was really impressed by that body of work when I read a lot of it at once. And it's what she does for me is she frees us up from a kind of a structure agency dialectic problem where the two are sort of trapped by each other. You know, Bourdieu works so hard to get away from that, and it's difficult for him to do it. Giddens is sort of in this symmetrical arrangement. But, you know, the point that they're different strata of reality, you know, which is a kind of crude way to say it, but I think it makes the point about heterogeneity really well. And her explanation of why there is a difference between structure and agency, this sort of ontological difference, in that we have this capacity for the inner conversation and Vygotsky for me put that explained that inner conversation really well in his studies of early child development, you know, how it becomes established. I think maybe the Archer work on the inner conversation and where she did those 30 interviews with people about their inner conversations, might be a really good place to start to work on constructing a research program around this. Interestingly, she found that in one case, there was one person in the group of 30 who didn't really have an inner conversation or could scarcely refer to one. And that person was really struggling in life. You know, it was really difficult without that.
And I guess, if I may, Simon, just to say that it's that inner conversation that higher education, a sophisticated inner conversation with multiple resources, that has to be fundamental to the task of higher education.
Yes, that's right. In the sense we are in a constellation of inner conversations connecting to each other frequently.
Thank you very much, Susan and Simon. Simon, I think you've successfully sparkled lots of questions and curiosities and comments in the chat. So for the sake of time, I think I'll invite a group of from our audience, and then perhaps you can respond to all the points as the final remark, if that's okay. But that will mean that you'll need to be taking notes of it.
That will be fun. Well, let's see how we go.
Okay, so first of all, can I invite Yusuf Aldak to speak, please?
Hi, Yusuf.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Hong Kong. This is a bit dark here, like it's nighttime. But yeah, anyways, let me get to my question quickly. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Lots of food for thought. I'm interested in working more on self-formation, and my question is about the future. You know, what next steps do you think lie ahead? How do we move the theory forward in this regard? Thank you very much for the presentation. Let me keep my question short. I guess we're short on time.
Thank you very much,
wait for the
Yusuf.
others, yeah.
Yes, and then can I next invite Akiyoshi Umezawa, please?
Hi, Aki.
Hello, Simon, and thank you so much. And my question is actually almost the same with the use of I think it is very, very interesting topic, partly because that sometimes student-centered or the learner-centered approach are sometimes utilized as a kind of attack, political attack to the universities and higher education as a kind of the traditional union of the academics or the teachers. So that is what we are now experiencing, not only in your country, but also in Japan or the other country. And my point is that I would like to ask that about the future, especially, is it possible to articulate some discussion? I not really stick to the Harari's work, but much more like the contemporary work on the digital age discussion, how we could redefine sometimes the meaning of the human being, or so that is the main question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Aki. And then can I invite Anja to speak, please?
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about educational technology. How do you see, or that should be the role or can be the role of educational technology in fostering reflexivity and agency, considering that we're moving into hybrid environments quite quickly? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja. Then can I invite Paul to, I think Paul has a comment, and would you like to speak, please?
I think I'm fine because it's just a self-contained comment, but thank you. And thank you for the seminar, Simon. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you, Paul, for all you're doing.
Yes, and then on my list, I have Kathy. Kathy Luckett, would you be able to, are you still here? Would you like to ask your question?
Sorry, yes. Thank you. I'm just concerned about the sort of, it's almost inevitable to slip into a dualism between subject and object, structure and agency. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to this. You know, I know that Bhaskar tries to move beyond it in his ontology of persons, and he actually uses the concept of Ubuntu as one means of doing that. And I've just wondered if you've given any thought to that and what might be the implications for higher education and pedagogy and the way we understand community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And then the final question will be from Soyounglee. Soyoung, would you please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chen. Thank you, Simon. Wonderful and really good. I learned a lot. And it's wonderful to see how this idea of self-formation is evolving continuously. So as a lot of comments in this chat shows, self-formation is so comprehensive idea that everything can be self-formation. So I think it can also, cause some problems in empirical work, for example, like agency and self-formation can be used as bad words, like, because everything can be self-formation for some people. So how do we resolve this problem, or should we resolve this problem? And another question is, maybe this question is to myself. But this idea of self-formation and student-centeredness is already widely researched in psychology, especially when they study student learning and self-regulated learning. So how, as a researcher who studies self-formation, can we not repeat what they have already done, but also further this understanding about higher education and combining or building on this psychological idea? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Soyoung. And Simon, I think there's a final question from Sharon. Can I invite Sharon?
Yeah, thank you. Just really quickly, I just am curious about the pedagogical implications of agentic self-formation. I think someone else already alluded to that, but I see some connections with critical pedagogy, and I'd just love Simon to respond to that at this time.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I think there's also a final one from Joshua from the chat, and also another question from Yusuf about the self-formation in the authoritarian context. Yeah. So, and then can I invite Joshua to speak, please?
I am so sorry. Just a quick question. For parts of the world whereby higher education isn't attended by a majority of the student cohorts, is elitism inevitable in the process of self-formation being part of an elite group of students that are allowed to have access to higher education? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And then with this, I'll hand over to Simon for the final remarks.
Thanks, Shin. I'm going to duck out of two challenges there because I really need to prepare the answers properly. I've sort of become a bit wary now of being the instant expert on everything. I think it's the media would like that, us professors to be that, and the temptation is, of course, is there. But especially in rigorous academic frameworks like this one we're right now, we really should know what we're talking about. So I'm not going to advance a response to Kathy on Ubuntu and subject-object and structure agency. I'm going to think about that and look at it, and I'm happy to talk to you, Kathy, of course, on the email about that. On critical pedagogy, there's some great people in this webinar who could do better than I could about. I mean, I'm only beginning to work out what it means in terms of teaching and learning, where there's so much good work done, which I'm not an expert on, but I'm beginning to learn a bit more about. That's all I can say. So knowing that, I've got some very strong colleagues in that area, I'm not going to venture out with my boat into the unknown just yet on that question. But on the other questions, I mean, I think the Aki and Andrea, nice to see you, Andrea, are asking a really important question about digital technology and how that sort of fits with all of this about self-formation. So point I'd make is, I think we go back to another Vygotskian concept, the artifact, the idea that you use various devices, whether they're language or even ideas or they're physical objects to pass your sense of self-development through. And I mean, people use digital artifacts all the time as ways to build themselves formatively. In fact, we might do that as much as we do anything else educationally now, using various forms of digital mechanism, communication, hardware and software to achieve certain effects that lead to our own growth and perhaps our intersubjective growth with others, our collective growth, not just their individual growth. So I think there's a really rich examination there where we look at, as many people are, about how people are using technology, but we focus on the core elements in the self-formation argument, which are particularly autonomy and reflexivity. And the sort of point I'd make in response to Soyoung, the dilemma of how do you contain this, what are we really talking, is it everything, or has it already been done before? Which are real questions, I think, especially with something which you're not quite sure about, which is just emerging. I would say that, the way we give priority to things is partly through, what we give attention to. And what we give attention to in this body of ideas, I think, is the key to what it is, and where it can take us. And I think probably reflexivity, is right at the heart of this. Reflexivity of in terms of one's personal development, life journey, and life project. Now, they're not new ideas, but I don't think a lot of work's been done within education on using that core emphasis. You're absolutely right about psychology. It's really made significant advances in all of these areas. Self-efficacy, a concept which they work with well. I mean, I think the difference that a lot of us feel who are on the sociological side of the social sciences with psych is that, it does emphasize a more hierarchical and more equilibrium-centered view of society and the world, and its basic ontology is fairly fixed, and it's always having to try and break out of that when it's confronted with empirical evidence, which takes it beyond those frameworks. So psych is not instinctively drawn to the idea of agentic power, and the student at the center. It's always positioning the student as part of an institutional structure with counsellors there to help the student stay on the straight and narrow psychologically, teachers there to sort of guide and so on. And the notion of the student as the real learner, it doesn't naturally arise in this framework. So I think, what's originality, what's creativity? A lot of the time it's taking existing things that we know about and just putting a new idea into them and reinterpreting and re-understanding them so that it becomes something new. And I think if you take the kind of politics of, the student as agent at the center, it changes everything. It changes the way we think about higher education. And a lot of what I'm saying, I think, is not new, but by using that agentic focus and that focus on especially the consciousness, the reflexivity, the sense of controlling your own life under conditions which you don't control, that notion of being, I think that changes things. So I think Susan was absolutely right to use the word ontology. I think we end up back there. That's where we're drawing a lot of our ideas now from. That's what that critical realism has done. It's put ontology at the center of the problem, and that enriches everything else. I haven't covered everything yet, Shin. I'm going to have to shoot because I've got to go to an advisory board meeting at 3 o'clock UK time, and I missed Yusuf's next steps question, which is a really important. But I think that a number of different directions. I think the direction you've taken with in your own work with focusing on the civic and relational realm and the sociability of students. That's one way to think about self-formation, looking at collectivities, whether they're the friendship group or they're a much larger social group. That's one direction. Another direction I think is probably into, reflexivity, the inner conversation, doing kind of anthropological work with individual cases, tracing how people change and how they talk about how they change, how their self-consciousness becomes more acute over time, all those sorts of things. So there's quite a localized individual dimension, and there's a social relational one, which I think you're in. I think these are all, in a sense, part of the family. But the main thing we've got to do, I think, is get some papers out and start talking and see if we have got something here to work with. Shin, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. Really fascinating. And I trust the conversation will continue. And our next CG webinar is next Tuesday on another really intriguing topic about bankers in the ivory tower, the troubling rise of financiers in the US higher education. So thank you and take care, everyone, and bye for now.